Looking back at the recent Brazilian election, it's hard not to focus on Jair Bolsonaro himself, with his defense of a brutal dictatorship and his encouragement of violence against perceived others. But journalists should spare some critical attention for the election itself, which saw the leading candidate, former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva of the PT, or Workers' Party, jailed and bumped from the race, under circumstances that warrant more attention than U.S. media have seen fit to provide. You may have heard that Bolsonaro is a Trump admirer, but the relationship between anti-democracy in Brazil and the U.S. goes well beyond that. Here to help us understand some of this is Brian Mier. He's an editor at Brazil Wire and editor of the book Voices of the Brazilian Left. He's a regular correspondent for the radio show This Is Hell, as well as a freelance writer and producer. He joins us now by phone from Sao Paulo. Welcome to CounterSpin, Brian Mier.
Hi, how are you?
Well, when twice-elected Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff was being pushed out in what many called a legislative coup, U.S. readers weren't reading quotes from the Organization of American States, for example, that was saying that this was not kosher, nor were they hearing about the objections of neighboring countries, some of whom pulled their ambassadors in protest, except perhaps via headlines like USA Today's "Leftist Leaders Leap to Defense of Ousted Brazilian President." So U.S. readers were set up kind of weirdly for this election. Corruption was associated, if vaguely, with Dilma. And then when her successor, Michel Temer, was clearly embroiled in stuff, Brazil was dismissed, as the New York Times put it, as just a, quote, turmoil-prone nation, close quote. So then with the election itself, I mean, we heard about it, but the big picture problems with it, like the leading candidate being in jail, were treated as externalities. What do you think that U.S. listeners should know about the Brazilian election? What complicates the idea that Bolsonaro is a simple expression of what Brazilians want?
Well, I guess the main point is that the leading candidate was arrested as part of a U.S. cooperative anti-corruption investigation between the U.S. Department of Justice and the Brazilian Public Prosecutor's Office. Now, he was arrested with no material evidence, and the main beneficiaries of the fact that he and the PT party were removed from the race this year are American corporations. And so I think that Americans should know that their government, their corporations, had a hand in what's happening down here and had a hand in the return to fascism. And I guess a second point is just that Bolsonaro is not the Brazilian Trump. He shouldn't be normalized. Some Americans might think, well, Trump's terrible, but, the United States hasn't crashed and burned since he took office. So Bolsonaro come to office in Brazil probably won't be that big of a deal either. But it's not the case. He's not a Brazilian Trump. He's a fascist. Trump may say some things that are fascist, but Jair Bolsonaro is literally a former official from a neo-fascist military government, that ruled as a state of exception. They used to, for example, categorize all people as workers or bums. So if you were walking down the street, unable to prove to a policeman that you had a job through showing documentation proving that, you would get arrested during the dictatorship. That's not something that's happening under Trump. Brazil under Bolsonaro won't be like the U.S. under Trump. It will be more repressive.
Just want to ask you one other question about Lula, because I think people had heard that Lula da Silva was in jail, but I think they might not understand how that happened. And for example, a Washington Post news story I was quoting before from an op-ed, an analysis piece, but in their, straight news story, the Washington Post said that Lula's, quote, re-election bid was upended when he landed in jail this year on corruption charges, close quote. There are very particular factors about Lula not just being in jail, but not being able to run from jail.
Well, yeah, exactly. The coverage has been really misleading. It's unfortunate. What especially bothers me is the way it's misleading in publications that have progressive readers. I mean, I can understand Fox News or something giving misleading, slanted coverage against Lula because he's a leftist. But it's very frustrating to see Washington Post, New York Times, NPR run this innuendo and these semi-truths and mistruths about why Lula was arrested. The fact is that he was convicted of committing undetermined acts. The judge, Sergio Moro, who's the leader of this U.S. Department of Justice, Brazilian public prosecutor's joint operation called Operation Car Wash, was allowed to rule on his own investigation with no jury in eccentric Brazilian legal tradition, which goes back to the Inquisition. His literal title is that of inquisitor. He set up the investigation, and he was allowed to judge on his own multi-year investigation. Okay, and the ruling was that they could not define any specific act of corruption that Lula committed. First, they accused him of being involved in Petrobras petroleum company corruption. That charge was removed from the court case 2 years ago. The day Lula was arrested, the Guardian said that his arrest was connected to Petrobras corruption, which is erroneous. It was not. In fact, the judge said that specifically there was no Petrobras connection in the ruling. His corruption charges were connected to supposed illegal reforms in a beachfront apartment. The courts were unable to prove that Lula ever owned the apartment. The apartment is registered in the name of the building company that built the building. They were unable to prove that he ever visited the apartment, and they were unable to prove that any reforms actually took place. Nevertheless, even if he had received a free apartment and gotten these reforms that clearly didn't happen because they've taken pictures inside the apartment, it's a mess. Even if that had happened, the date that they alleged this all took place was after he left office. So there was no way of proving quid quo pro. Furthermore, the case is handled in Curitiba, Paraná, a neighboring state, in a local court, which has no jurisdiction in the town where the apartment exists. So it's just full of improprieties. And I feel like what you see these days with a lot of journalism is it's almost just like PR that they repeat in a lot of papers when they talk about foreign news. I didn't see any journalist for a major American newspaper do any kind of investigative work on this, weighing the merits of the case against Lula or not. They just kept repeating what the prosecution was saying the whole time. And the ironic thing is it's not even the first time that a former Brazilian president has had his life destroyed over phony allegations involving reforms on an apartment. Because when the military dictatorship took office in 1964, the media spent a year and a half accusing former president Juscelino Kubitschek, who was still very popular at the time, of having received illegal reforms on a luxury apartment in Ipanema. And after a year and a half, it came out that he was never the owner of the apartment. So they didn't even invent an original way to arrest Lula.
Well, and you're right, of course, that in U.S. reporting on the election, that was, to say underexplored is to say too little. We saw phrases as like in that Washington Post story, well, Lula landed in jail, and there was definitely assumption that he deserved to be there, and that should not be factored in when we were thinking about what would happen with the election. Well, another thing that I was surprised by was in a Washington Post news story, it was really focused about Bolsonaro's social media-centered campaign. He overcame challenges with the power of social media, speaking directly to voters. We were told that backers became voracious consumers of his missives on Twitter and WhatsApp, where we're told white men and wealthy voters eager to turn the page after a decade of left-wing rule rallied to Bolsonaro's side. This Washington Post piece had space for how Bolsonaro grew up a nerdy kid in a German-Italian family, but they didn't have any mention of the slush fund, which other accounts have led me to understand was reportedly used to fund this social media campaign that the Post is profiling, and that was also super hateful, was it not?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Okay, first of all, start from the starting point that when Lula was removed from the presidential race illegally against the orders of the UN Human Rights Committee, which are legally binding in Brazil, because Brazil signed the second optional protocol on political and civil rights, the UN. When Lula was pulled out of the race, he'd been behind bars for 2.5 months in solitary confinement, prohibited from speaking to the press. And he still had more. He was polling higher than every other candidate combined in the polls. He had more than double the support of Bolsonaro when he was removed from the race a month before the election. Okay, so then you look at what Bolsonaro did. Steve Bannon apparently was helping a little bit with this. They set up an illegal campaign slush fund that had over 4 times the monetary value in it as Bolsonaro's entire official campaign fund. And they used it to illegally obtain personal data on targeted segments of WhatsApp users. Brazil is the biggest consumer of this WhatsApp social media app in the world. Over half of all Brazilians use it. And so they created thousands and thousands of WhatsApp groups of 256 people each, specifically targeted to certain demographics like evangelical Christian women, for example. And they just bombarded them with slander and hate speech. Okay, so for example, there was a poll that came out that said 87% of the people who voted for Bolsonaro believe that when the PT party was in power, they created a gay kit and distributed it in the public school system to try to convince children to become homosexuals. 87%, okay? They were spreading information that Fernando Haddad, who was Lula's replacement candidate, was a child molester. They said that if Haddad was elected, the government was going to create a kind of panel that would declare whether children were gay or not at the age of 5. And they bombarded evangelical Christians with this. And so the main reason that Bolsonaro was elected was because 87% of his voters thought that Fernando Haddad's government would try to make their children gay. Because their brains are just fried by this illegal use of social media apps. Just like in the US, you have all these Americans now who think the earth is flat. It's like this kind of thing. So it's hardly, as they're saying in the media, Brazilians are worried about violence. Brazilians, they're worried about corruption. That wasn't it. It was straight up, homophobia was like the main social media factor in getting Bolsonaro elected. Another thing they did was, I don't know if you saw these Not Him protests that happened all over the world, right? Mm-hmm. On the day of those protests, Bolsonaro's people took these photos from slut walk protests that had happened, a year earlier of, how slut walk is, topless women in lingerie, kissing and stuff like that. And they bombarded millions of Brazilians with images from slut walk saying that these were live photos taken in the Not Him protests. And so immediately after this, after the Not Him protests, which were huge protests, also underreported in the media, there was at least 1 million people on the streets in Brazil, 150,000 in Sao Paulo alone. And American newspapers were saying tens of thousands of people nationwide, right? Huge protests. After they ended, Bolsonaro gained 5 percentage points in the polls with women because they bombarded evangelical Christian women with these slut walk photos.
So there's a lot missing from U.S. media coverage of the election itself, but then what was in it was, in some cases, just craven is the word that comes to mind. We talked a couple of weeks back on the show about U.S. financial media, kind of the business pages. The New York Times had a story in the business section. Brazil's markets have surged on hope of Bolsonaro victory. Can he deliver? And the concern in that Times story was that Bolsonaro might not actually follow through on his plans to cut pensions, and to cut Social Security, though they said markets are optimistic. There's at least a kind of frankness in that business reporting, that straight up says, we don't care about fascism as long as, the bottom line is happy. But straight news pieces tend to kind of take that investor point of view, but then they try to retrofit some kind of democratic principle in there. And so you certainly wouldn't get a sense of U.S. involvement, U.S. meddling in Brazilian politics, which you're talking about this time around. It's certainly not the first time in terms of U.S. Meddling there.
Yeah, of course not. In fact, I mean, let's be frank. There aren't really any countries in Latin America that the U.S. doesn't meddle in.
Right, right.
I mean, there was a Harvard Review article published in the 90s which counted 44 U.S.-backed coups in Latin America between 1898 and 1994. And so we're in a situation where the U.S. was involved in the 1964 coup in Brazil and actively supported the dictatorship, which lasted until 1985. Bolsonaro was a member of that government, and he's appointing 3 former generals who were also active during the dictatorship to cabinet positions. I mean, that alone shows there's at the very least, a hangover of U.S. meddling in this current situation.